The courtroom was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, charged with anticipation. Rows of wooden benches were filled with spectators, some there out of civic duty, others simply curious, and a few, no doubt, drawn by the drama that courts inevitably summon. At the center of it all sat Judge Theodore Whitman, a man with decades of experience presiding over cases ranging from the mundane to the headline-worthy. His reputation was well established. Stern, but fair, a by-the-book judge who rarely let emotion guide his decisions. Today, however, his sense of authority was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Across the room, the defendant stood poised, her expression calm but resolute. Her name was Simone Hall, a black woman in her early 40s with an undeniable air of confidence. She wore a tailored blazer and exuded the kind of composure that hinted at a life spent under scrutiny. Yet, to most in the courtroom, she was just another name on the docket, a stranger awaiting judgment. No one, not even Judge Whitman, seemed to recognize her, or so it appeared. The charge was relatively minor, a parking violation that escalated into a dispute over an unpaid ticket. A routine matter, nothing that would normally draw attention. But from the moment Simone spoke, her voice steady and articulate, there was an undercurrent in the air, as though she were far more than the sum of her supposed infraction. The judge, however, remained indifferent, focused solely on the case before him. "Miss Hall," Judge Whitman began, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the file in front of him. "It seems we're here today over a failure to pay a fine issued for parking in a restricted zone. The court has noted the penalty amount has not been settled despite several notices. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Simone clasped her hands together, her gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the circumstances surrounding this ticket were not as straightforward as they appear on paper." Her calm tone was not defensive but deliberate, as though she knew the weight of her words would eventually sink in. The judge raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued despite himself. Still, his demeanor remained firm. "Miss Hall, whether or not the circumstances are straightforward, the fact remains the fine has gone unpaid. The law is clear in these matters." The tension in the room thickened, as though everyone present could sense that this exchange was heading somewhere unexpected. Simone didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her voice carrying a quiet but undeniable authority. "Your Honor, I understand the law. In fact, I helped shape it." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a collective intake of breath as spectators exchanged glances. Judge Whitman's brow furrowed, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Miss Hall," he said slowly, his tone now laced with curiosity, "would you care to elaborate on that statement?" Simone allowed the question to linger in the air for a moment before answering, her words measured and precise. "I serve as a state legislator, Your Honor. My job is to advocate for justice, equity, and the very laws we're discussing here today." The revelation landed like a thunderclap. The courtroom, which had been so silent moments ago, now felt alive with suppressed reactions. The judge, caught off guard, struggled to maintain his composure. He leaned back in his chair, studying Simone with newfound attention. For the first time, the dynamic in the room shifted. This was no ordinary defendant, and Judge Whitman knew it. But Simone wasn't finished. "I chose to appear today not because I couldn't handle this matter through other channels," she continued, her voice steady, "but because I believe in accountability, even when it's inconvenient. I believe in the rule of law, not just for those who are subject to it, but also for those who create and enforce it." The judge's gaze narrowed, his mind racing as he processed the implications of her words. This case was no longer about a parking ticket. It was about something far greater, the intersection of power, privilege, and responsibility. But before he could respond, Simone added one final note, her tone firm, but not confrontational. "However, Your Honor, I also believe that laws must be applied fairly and equitably. And as someone who has dedicated her life to serving the people, I feel compelled to ask, are we truly doing justice here today?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the weight of her words settled over the courtroom. Judge Whitman, for all his years on the bench, found himself at a crossroads. He could proceed as planned, treating this as just another case, or he could confront the deeper issues Simone had so deftly brought to light. And as the spectators leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next, one thing became clear. This was a moment that neither Judge Whitman nor anyone else in that courtroom would soon forget. Judge Whitman hesitated for a beat too long, his silence revealing a struggle to regain control of the moment. Simone Hall had disrupted the rhythm of his court, at words a quiet declaration of resistance and purpose. The gallery, now abuzz with whispers and darting glances, was a sea of anticipation. Who was this woman, really? And why was she here, standing before a judge, defending herself over something as trivial as a parking ticket? The judge finally cleared his throat. Miss Hall, while I appreciate your candor and your position, the issue at hand is still a matter of law. The specifics of your role as a legislator, while admirable, do not exempt you from accountability under the statutes of this court. Simone's lips curled into a faint smile, a gesture not of defiance, but of someone who anticipated this very response. Accountability, Your Honor, she said, her voice even, is a principle I hold deeply. It's also why I find myself here today, not in avoidance of responsibility, but in pursuit of fairness. The courtroom doors opened quietly at the back, and the young man entered, clutching a notebook and phone, his face flushed as though he had run to get there. He slid into an empty seat near the rear, his presence unnoticed by most but keenly observed by Simone. A slight nod passed between them, fleeting but loaded with meaning. It was clear she wasn't entirely alone in this. Simone's gaze returned to Judge Whitman. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the podium where she stood, silently requesting permission to expand her point. The judge waved her on, though his expression remained guarded. You may proceed, Miss Hall. Simone adjusted her stance, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. Her voice carried a subtle urgency now, as though she understood the significance of this moment, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. Your Honor, I'm here not to dispute the laws as written, but to challenge how they are applied, she began. This ticket, as minor as it seems, represents something larger, a pattern that disproportionately affects individuals who look like me. Studies show that minor infractions are more likely to escalate for black and brown individuals than for others. And while the law may be blind in its wording, it is not always so in its execution. The murmur in the gallery grew louder, a mix of agreement and skepticism rippling through the crowd. Judge Whitman's expression darkened slightly, his features taut as though bracing against an uncomfortable truth. Simone continued. I chose to contest this ticket in person, she said, her voice unwavering, because I wanted to highlight how these small penalties often become traps for working-class individuals, penalties that, over time, can spiral into insurmountable burdens. For some, this is just a fine. For others, it's the difference between putting food on the table and keeping their car, their job, their dignity. The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Miss Hall, this court is not here to debate socioeconomic policies. Our purpose is to uphold the law as it stands. Simone met his gaze without flinching. And I respect that, Your Honor. But if the law is applied without consideration of its impact on real lives, then it fails to serve its purpose. Justice is not merely about adherence to rules. It's about fairness in their enforcement. At that moment, the young man at the back stood up briefly, raising his phone as though capturing a quick photo or note. The action was subtle, but it caught the judge's attention. His sharp eyes flicked toward the disruption, his brow furrowing. Is there a reason for this interruption? He asked pointedly. The man lowered his phone immediately. Apologies, Your Honor, he said, his voice nervous but polite. Just taking notes. Public hearing, right? The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, but he let it slide, turning his focus back to Simone. Miss Hall, while your points are thought-provoking, they do not absolve you of your obligation. This court operates on precedent and legal framework, not on individual philosophies. Simone nodded, as though conceding the point, but there was no defeat in her expression. I understand, Your Honor, and I don't expect this court to rewrite the law today. What I do hope for is a consideration of context, a recognition that justice must account for the human experience, not just legal definitions. Her words hum in the air, heavy with implication. The judge glanced at the file before him, his mind visibly turning over the situation. He had dealt with countless cases like this before, but none had unfolded quite like this one. None had challenged him to look beyond the surface of the law and into its deeper impact on the lives it governed. Meanwhile, the spectators were fully engrossed, their whispers now barely audible as they waited for the next turn in this unfolding drama. Simone, standing alone at the podium, seemed both vulnerable and unshakable, a presence commanding attention without demanding it. The young man in the back scribbled furiously in his notebook, his earlier nervousness replaced by a sense of purpose. He glanced towards Simone occasionally, his expression one of admiration and perhaps a touch of awe. It was clear he wasn't just an observer. He was invested in this moment, perhaps even a part of the story unfolding before the court. The judge finally spoke, his voice measured but carrying a note of caution. Miss Hall, while your arguments are compelling, this court must consider the facts as presented. If you wish to address systemic issues, the proper venue would be the legislature, not this courtroom. Simone inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement. I hear you, Your Honor. And trust me, I'm working on that front as well. But sometimes the most effective change starts in moments like these, when we confront the systems directly. Judge Whitman exhaled through his nose, his frustration barely concealed. He was a man bound by his role, constrained by rules that didn't always leave room for nuance. And yet, as he looked at Simone, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a case. It was a mirror held up to the very institution he served. The tension in the room remained electric, the unresolved conflict lingering like a storm cloud. Simone stood her ground, her eyes steady on the judge, as though daring him not to break the law, but to bend the lens through which he viewed it. And as the seconds stretched into a charged silence, the young man in the back leaned forward slightly, his pen poised over the page, ready to capture the next chapter in a story that was far from over. The courtroom silence stretched thin, taut like a wire ready to snap. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, his fingers tented in front of him, while Simone Hall stood at the podium, a picture of unyielding resolve. This wasn't just a parking ticket dispute anymore. It was a battleground for principles, a quiet rebellion against the invisible forces of bias and systemic inequity. In the gallery, the young man with the notebook kept glancing at Simone, his face a blend of admiration and worry. He wasn't just a note-taker. He was a thread woven into her story. As the judge seemed to deliberate, the young man's mind raced back to the phone call he had received from Simone just 2 days earlier. It's a small case, she had said, her voice steady, but tinged with an undertone he hadn't quite understood at the time. But small cases have a way of exposing big truths. Simone had always been like this, he thought, relentless in her pursuit of fairness, even when it would have been easier to turn the other way. He had worked with her as an aide in the state legislature, watching her navigate rooms full of skepticism, pushing back against entrenched systems without ever losing her calm. This case wasn't an accident. She had chosen this battle deliberately, knowing full well it could spiral into something much larger. Across the room, Judge Whitman sighed audibly. Miss Hall, he began, his voice carrying the weight of a man trying to remain impartial in the face of mounting complexity. If what you're suggesting is that this court operates under systemic bias, I must remind you that such allegations require substantial evidence. This is not the venue for broad accusations. Simone didn't flinch. Your Honor, she replied, her tone measured, I'm not accusing this court of anything. I'm pointing to the patterns that are well documented and often ignored. This isn't personal. It's structural. Her words lingered, prompting a few nods from those seated in the gallery. Among them, an older woman with graying hair and sharp eyes leaned forward slightly. She had come out of curiosity, but now found herself captivated. The mention of systemic patterns struck a chord with her, recalling her own experience as a young activist decades ago. She knew the dance Simone was performing, a delicate balance of asserting truth without alienating power. It was a fine line to walk. The judge tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, a signal to restore order as murmurs began to bubble up again. Miss Hall, this court does not operate on abstract notions. If you wish to argue your case, stick to the specifics of your infraction. Simone nodded, but didn't back down. Your Honor, the specifics are clear. I'm not contesting the fact that my car was parked in a restricted zone. But what I am contesting is the chain of events that followed, the punitive escalation that turned a small fine into a court appearance. These escalations disproportionately affect certain communities. I'm here today not just for myself, but for the countless others who don't have the platform to raise their voices. The young man in the back scribbled furiously, trying to capture her every word. He knew the stakes were high, not just for Simone, but for the broader conversation she was trying to ignite. This wasn't about parking violations. It was about visibility, fairness, and accountability. He glanced briefly at the older woman a few rows ahead, noticing her nodding subtly in agreement. He wondered how many others in the room saw the bigger picture unfolding before them. Judge Whitman rubbed his temple, clearly grappling with the growing weight of the moment. Miss Hall, he said after a pause, you speak passionately, but this court is not a forum for political advocacy. You have a platform as a legislator to address these issues. Why bring this case here? Simone hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted her words to land with precision. Because, Your Honor, she said finally, that law isn't just written in the halls of the legislature. It's enacted here, in rooms like this, where decisions are made every day that ripple out into people's lives. Change doesn't start at the top. It starts where the impact is felt. For a moment, the judge looked at her with something close to respect, though he quickly masked it. This was no ordinary defendant. He could feel the eyes of the gallery on him, waiting for his response, his judgment, his stance on what had become more than a legal matter. It was a moral question now, though he would never admit it aloud. The older woman in the gallery suddenly raised her hand, a bold move that drew the attention of everyone in the room. Your Honor, she said, her voice firm but polite. May I speak? The judge hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to such direct interruptions. This is highly irregular, he said, his tone cautious. But something the woman's steady gaze made him pause. Very well. Briefly. The woman stood, her presence commanding despite her age. My name is Evelyn Carter, she said, and I've seen this story play out before. Different faces, same fight. Miss Hall is right to stand here today. Because if these conversations don't happen in spaces like this, they'll never happen at all. Simone glanced at Evelyn, gratitude flickering across her face. She hadn't expected anyone to step in, but Evelyn's words felt like a lifeline, a quiet acknowledgement that this battle wasn't hers alone. Judge Whitman, visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. Miss Carter, while I appreciate your perspective, this court is bound by procedure. We cannot allow every voice in the gallery to weigh in. Evelyn nodded, taking her seat without protest, but her point had been made, and the ripple of agreement in the room was impossible to ignore. The tension continued to build, a powder keg of ideals, authority, and the quiet rebellion of truth seeking a place to stand. Simone turned back to the judge, her voice calm but insistent. Your Honor, all I'm asking for today is a fair hearing, not just for myself, but for the countless others who come into rooms like this and leave feeling unseen, unheard. This isn't about me. It's about the integrity of the system we all serve. The judge stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The weight of her words pressed against him, challenging not just his judgment, but the very foundation of the institution he represented. The gallery held its collective breath, waiting for his next move. But in that charged silence, one thing was clear. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What began as a mundane hearing over a parking violation was now charged with something much greater. A clash of ideals, a confrontation of systemic realities, and an unspoken battle for understanding. Judge Whitman's face remained a mask of professional detachment, but the way his fingers tapped against the arm of his chair betrayed his inner turmoil. Simone Hall's words had struck a chord deeper than he wanted to admit, and the courtroom felt like a stage teetering on the edge of an unpredictable climax. Simone stood at the podium, her shoulders squared, her composure unbroken. She had always known this wasn't just about her. The young man in the back had texted her earlier, whispering encouragement. Asterisk, you've got this. Make them see. Asterisk, and now she felt the weight of every person in that room, those silently rooting for her and those waiting to see her fail. The judge's gavel came down softly, more a gesture to center himself than to call order. Miss Hall, he said finally, his voice firm but quieter now, your arguments are compelling, but this court operates on evidence and precedent. What specific evidence do you have to support the claim that your case is an example of systemic inequity? Simone drew a slow breath. This was the moment she had anticipated, the crossroads she had prepared for. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady, but tinged with an edge of urgency, my evidence lies in the data that exists beyond this courtroom, in the lives affected every day by policies that appear neutral on paper, but carry a disproportionate burden in practice. She gestured toward a small stack of papers her young aide had placed on the table earlier. I've brought reports detailing how penalties for minor infractions are more frequently compounded for individuals in marginalized communities. These patterns are well documented in studies by the Department of Justice, among others. The judge frowned slightly, glancing toward the documents. His hesitation spoke volumes. Accepting those papers as evidence would mean acknowledging that this case might indeed be more than it appeared. But refusing to engage with them would risk the perception of bias, an irony that wasn't lost on him. Simone pressed on. Your Honor, I also submitted a timeline in my case detailing the escalation from a simple parking fine to this courtroom. I believe you'll find it consistent with those broader patterns. This isn't just my story, it's a microcosm of a much larger issue. The gallery stirred again, and a few voices whispered among themselves. Evelyn Carter, the older woman who had spoken earlier, leaned forward in her seat, her sharp eyes fixed on the judge. She knew how delicate this moment was, how much rested on the next words spoken in that room. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing as it met Simone's. Miss Hall, are you suggesting this court, my court, operates under a bias against certain individuals? Simone held his gaze without flinching. I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that bias exists in every system, including the judicial one. It's not about you personally, it's about the structures we've inherited and how they operate, often unconsciously. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Every eye was on Judge Whitman, waiting to see how he would respond. He tapped his fingers against the desk again, his mind clearly racing. For a man who had built his career on impartiality, the implication that the very system he served might be flawed was a hard pill to swallow. Suddenly, the young man at the back stood up again, his nervousness now replaced by determination. Your Honor, I'm sorry, but may I say something? The judge's eyes flicked toward him, his irritation barely concealed. Who are you, and why do you believe you have the right to address this court? I'm Jason, the young man said, stepping forward slightly. I'm Miss Hall's legislative aide, and I've watched her work tirelessly for years, fighting for fairness and equity in laws that affect people who often don't have a voice. She's not here to disrespect this court. She's here because she believes in it, because she believes it's capable of better. The judge's expression shifted, his irritation melting into something harder to define. Jason's words carried a raw sincerity that couldn't be dismissed, even if his interruption was highly irregular. Simone turned toward Jason, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. Thank you, Jason, she said softly before addressing the judge again. Your Honor, my presence here today isn't about challenging your authority. It's about inviting this court to be part of a solution. A small step, perhaps, but an important one. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable as he considered her words. The room was silent again, the collective breath of the gallery held as they awaited his response. Even Evelyn Carter seemed to hold still, her usually fidgety hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, Judge Whitman spoke, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. Miss Hall, you've raised points that extend beyond the scope of this case. While this court is limited in its ability to address systemic issues, I will review the materials you've submitted and consider your argument in the context of this specific matter. The words were measured cautious, but they carried the faintest hint of concession. Simone nodded, recognizing the small victory in his response. But the battle was far from over. She knew that the decision, whatever it turned out to be, would ripple far beyond the walls of that courtroom. And as the gallery buzzed with whispers once more, Simone stood tall, a resolve unshaken. She had come here to tell a story, one not just about her, but about everyone who had ever been overlooked or unfairly burdened by a system that claimed to serve them. And though the resolution was still uncertain, she felt the tide beginning to shift, the weight of truth pressing against the cracks in the status quo. The courtroom seemed to hum with anticipation, the energy shifting subtly but unmistakably. Simone Hall stood firm, her mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. Judge Whitman's cautious concession had given her a foothold, but it also left her in a precarious position. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. She felt the tension in the air, thick as fog, pressing against her from all sides. This was a moment that would either crumble under its weight or ignite something far greater. As Judge Whitman began reviewing the documents Simone had provided, a faint sound broke the silence. The courtroom doors creaking open. Heads turned as a man in a crisp navy suit strode in, his presence commanding attention. He wasn't an ordinary spectator, that much was clear. The man carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to wielding influence, and as he took a seat in the back, his eyes locked onto Simone with a sharp intensity. Simone's stomach tightened. She recognized him instantly. Stephen Marsh, the city attorney. His presence here was unexpected and unsettling. Marsh was known for his ability to sway narratives, often stepping into cases where the stakes were higher than they appeared. His involvement now suggested that this case had gained a significance far beyond her initial expectations. Judge Whitman glanced up briefly, his eyes narrowing as he noted Marsh's arrival. "Mr. Marsh," he said, his voice carrying an edge of surprise, "I wasn't aware this case required your attention." Marsh offered a tight smile, his tone smooth and measured. "Your Honor, I'm here as an observer. For now. This case seems to have drawn considerable public interest, and I thought it prudent to familiarize myself with the proceedings." Simone's pulse quickened. She knew better than to take Marsh's words at face value. His mere presence added a layer of complexity she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never really had been, but now it was undeniable. The stakes had risen, and the scrutiny was sharper than ever. As the judge continued to review the documents, Marsh's gaze never wavered from Simone. She could feel it, a weight pressing against her resolve. But she refused to look away. If anything, his presence only solidified her determination. Whatever game he was playing, she wasn't about to back down. The courtroom buzzed quietly as the judge finished flipping through the pages. He set them down with a sigh, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hall," he said, "you've presented some compelling evidence, though I must emphasize that this court's purview is limited. However," before he could finish, Marsh stood abruptly. "Your Honor, and if I may," he interjected smoothly, "given the broader implications raised by Miss Hall's argument, I believe it would be appropriate to consider this case in a wider context. I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my office and determine the best course of action." Simone's jaw tightened. A recess. It was a classic tactic, a way to buy time and potentially shift the momentum. She glanced at Jason, who looked equally concerned but tried to hide it behind a mask of neutrality. Evelyn Carter, seated a few rows behind, frowned deeply, her earlier confidence replaced by unease. Judge Whitman hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Marsh's sudden involvement. After a long pause, he nodded reluctantly. "Very well. This court will recess for 30 minutes. We'll reconvene promptly at that time." The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted into a low murmur as people began to file out. Simone remained at the podium, her hands gripping its edges as she processed the sudden turn of events. Jason hurried to her side, his voice low and urgent. "Simone, what does this mean? Why is Marsh here?" Simone shook her head, her mind racing. "It means this isn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It means they're worried." Jason frowned. "Worried about what?" Simone glanced toward the back of the courtroom, where Marsh was already engaged in a quiet but intense conversation with someone on his phone. Worried that this case might expose something they don't want people to see. As the gallery emptied, Evelyn approached, her movements deliberate. "Simone," she said quietly, "you need to be ready. Marsh doesn't show up unless there's more at stake than they're letting on." Simone nodded, her resolve hardening. "I know, and I'm not backing down." Evelyn placed a hand on her shoulder, her grip firm. "Good, but be careful. The closer you get to the truth, the harder they'll push back." Simone met Evelyn's gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a fight for accountability, for visibility, for the voices that had been ignored for too long. And as the clock ticked down toward the next round of proceedings, she felt the stakes rising to a level she hadn't fully anticipated. Whatever was coming next, she knew it would test her in ways she hadn't yet imagined. The courtroom reconvened, the tension palpable as Judge Whitman returned to his seat, followed closely by Stephen Marsh, who carried an air of quiet confidence. Simone Hall stood ready, her shoulders squared despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Jason had whispered a few last-minute words of encouragement, and Evelyn's steady presence in the gallery lent her a sense of calm. Whatever was about to happen, she had come too far to falter now. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and addressed the room. "We've had a brief but important recess, and I understand that Mr. Marsh has prepared a statement on behalf of the city." His tone was clipped, his face unreadable. "Mr. Marsh, you may proceed." Marsh stood, his every movement calculated. He approached the bench with measured steps, glancing at Simone briefly before addressing the court. "Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence presented and considering the broader implications of this case, the city believes it would be prudent to dismiss the charges against Miss Hall. This dismissal, however, comes with the understanding that further discussions on the systemic issues raised today will occur in the appropriate legislative forums." The room erupted into murmurs. Simone's initial reaction was disbelief, dismiss the charges. It felt like a win, but something about Marsh's phrasing set off alarm bells. His calm demeanor wasn't one of defeat. It was one of control, as though he had managed to steer the narrative to his advantage. Judge Whitman raised a hand to quiet the gallery before turning to Simone. "Miss Hall, it seems the charges against you are to be dropped. Do you have anything to add?" Simone stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, while I appreciate the dismissal, I can't help but question why it took this much effort to achieve a just outcome. The issues raised today won't disappear with the close of this case. They'll persist until we confront them head-on." Before the judge could respond, Marsh interjected. "Miss Hall, if I may, the city has every intention of addressing these concerns, but the courtroom isn't the appropriate venue for such discussions. Your position as a legislator gives you a platform to enact real change. I trust you'll use it wisely." His words were pointed, almost a challenge. Simone met his gaze, unflinching. "And I will," she replied. "But change doesn't happen in isolation. It requires accountability at every level, including here." The gallery buzzed with quiet applause, the tension easing slightly. But just as it seemed the proceedings were winding down, a voice from the back of the room cut through the noise. "Your Honor, I have evidence that might shed further light on this case." All heads turned as a young woman stepped forward, her hands clutching a tablet. She introduced herself as a paralegal from a local legal aid group. "I came across something during the recess. Public records showing a pattern of escalated fines and penalties disproportionately targeting individuals in specific neighborhoods. Miss Hall's case isn't an outlier, it's part of a trend." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Whitman gestured for her to approach, his face now a mask of concern. As he reviewed the data she presented, his expression darkened. "This is troubling," he said finally, his voice low. "Mr. Marsh, were you aware of this?" Marsh's composure faltered for the first time. "Your Honor, I wasn't privy to these specific records, but I'm certain the city will investigate thoroughly." Simone seized the moment. "Your Honor, this isn't just about one case. It's about a system that needs reform. Ignoring these patterns won't make them go away." The judge sighed deeply, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Miss Hall, you've made your point. And while this court cannot enact systemic change, it can acknowledge when something is wrong." He turned to Marsh. "I expect the city to address this promptly. Dismissal is not an end, it's a beginning." Simone felt a swell of vindication. But just as relief began to settle in, Marsh's next move revealed his true intent. "Your Honor," he said, his voice regaining its calm, "the city will cooperate fully. However, I must point out that systemic issues often arise from a lack of clear policy, not intentional bias. Perhaps Ms. Hall's legislative efforts could focus on providing the framework needed to address these gaps." It was a calculated statement, shifting responsibility back onto Simone while deflecting blame from the system. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Simone stepped forward one last time. "Mr. Marsh," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "you can try to redirect this conversation. But the truth remains. Change is coming, whether it starts here or somewhere else. I'm not afraid to fight for it." The finality in her tone left no room for rebuttal. As the judge officially dismissed the case, the gallery erupted into applause, the tension finally breaking. Simone walked out of the courtroom with Jason and Evelyn by her side, her mind already racing with plans for the next steps. The battle might be over, but the fight was just beginning.